Hello, everyone. It is Friday, July 16th. Welcome to Status Check with Spivey, where we talk about life, law school, admissions, a little bit of everything. Today, we're going to really focus on admissions, particularly this upcoming cycle and what we expect. I am joined today with Dave Killoran, the CEO of PowerScore, who's been in this industry for 30 years. I'm joined also with my business intelligence analyst, Justin Kane, who, how to describe Justin, if you were to think of a hyperbaric chamber, but instead of pumping in oxygen, is pumping in data, that's probably the best way to think of Justin. So without further delay, let me join Justin and Dave, and we'll start talking about the cycle. So I am with Dave Killoran and Justin Kane, and I think that we should just dive right in. What do you guys think?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it.
Who wants to go? You want to do a little bit of a recap of the previous cycle, which was a cycle, I hate the word unique. I've never seen a cycle close to this one in my 21-year history of doing this. Dave, you have 30 years, right?
It's somewhere in there, but you don't need to remind people of that.
Well, you're 31 years old. You started LSAT prep as a 1-year-old. What are your thoughts on this past cycle?
Worst cycle in history that I've gone through. I never want to see a cycle like this again.
Yeah, I don't have the history that you two do with this stuff, but man, what a cycle. Mike, I think the word unprecedented got used a lot. Is that better than unique?
Yeah, unprecedented has come up a lot. I tend to shy away from words that keep popping up. So I don't think anyone's ever heard me use the word holistic on a podcast before. We won't use that one. This was just a horrific cycle. As we all know, the delta between expectations for applicants and results was probably wider than possibly in anyone's lifetime. And I think particularly, and Justin, maybe you can chime in with some data. I mean, I think there's a lot of disappointed people. I don't want to undermine anyone who's disappointed. But I know that LSAT scores under 150 were actually down as far as applicants were under 150. But where they were most up was around 165 to 180.
Yeah, that's right. I think that difference between expectation and outcomes was one of the big problems this cycle. We've had, 8 or 9 years of applicant volume being down or flat, and people had kind of gotten used to that. You could really predict what your outcomes were going to be in a given cycle. We all know the websites, right? Law school data, law school numbers in its heyday, my LSN, all those. You could just go on, plug your numbers in, and see where you were likely to get in, see where you were going to get scholarships. And this cycle, that really fell apart. I think it wasn't just applicants that were surprised by this cycle. I think, we'll probably talk about this a little bit, but also law schools were very surprised. And when you had both of those things combined, it just created the chaos. Mike, you talked about applicants 150 and below actually being down, and that's right. There actually were fewer of those applicants. And the reason that that's important is because those are typically not the applicants who are being accepted to law school. Law schools use the LSAT to identify people who are likely to succeed academically. The LSAT does do a pretty good job of predicting the ability to succeed in law school, and law schools value that. And so those applicants, there are only about 20 schools or so this past year who had a median LSAT below 150, and they accounted for less than 10% of the number of matriculants, right? So when you're thinking about the folks in the 150 to 180 range on the LSAT, that's the bulk of the applicant pool. And in that range, we actually had about 23% more applicants than we did last year. And last year was higher than any year since the 2011 application cycle. So, we're looking at the end of this year, probably around 71,000 applicants to law school, 8,000 or 9,000 more than last year. It's a lot. It's a big increase. And like you said, even within that, the increase is really concentrated at the top, right? We've called that the bubble in LSAT applicants, right? Maybe not the greatest phrase, but it's what we ran with all year. Among 175 plus applicants, we have over twice as many as last year. It's just ridiculous. Among 170 to 180 applicants, it's about 50% more. All told, 170 to 180 applicants. We have just about as many this year as we did the 2 prior years combined. It's completely ridiculous. I mean, just the sheer volume in that range is something that I've never seen before. Dave, I mean, you can talk about this, but what do you think was contributing to that? We've seen a lot of people were maybe taking an opportunity in the pandemic to study more. They just didn't have as much time.
That's one explanation, but I would say that the word unprecedented was used before. I've never seen this type of bubble, this massive spike in scores at that level. 175 to 180 being the highest percentage growth, and as you said, over 100% doubling is just a massive thing. And of course, that fed into the law schools themselves not knowing what to do with that glut of applicants and having decision-making difficulties. And then that fed down to the applicants. And there's obviously been a lot of discussion about what caused this. There's a couple, I'd say, main suspects, main theories. I can tell you the one that LSAC promotes, and I certainly think it's one of the explanations, and that is that you can see students had more time to study, and instead of going out on a Friday night or a Saturday night because they couldn't anymore, all of a sudden they stayed in, and a lot of people used that time to study for the LSAT. And there are studies out there that show anywhere from, say, a 25 to 35% increase in the amount of time that LSAT takers used to prepare. And if you have someone who studies that much more, it's not that learning the LSAT is a linear exercise. It's not like 1 hour means 1 point, but the more time you spend, the better that you will do. And so that clearly had an impact here. People had more time, they used it, they did better. Obviously, there's a number of things you could point to, but the one that's probably the second that is most frequently bandied about is the idea that this was a shorter test and it was taken from the comfort of home. The reason this is an interesting one, and I say that it's debatable, is that LSAC says that this is not actually a factor. That the 3-section test and a 4-section test and a 5-section test all have roughly the same performance from the beginning to end. That's not what I see in the data that we have from our students when we give them tests of different length. And it also doesn't entirely follow what I would consider like the Occam's razor logic of what makes the most sense. If you're taking a test at home and it's shorter, so many people walked out happier and in a better mood about it because it wasn't this long, grueling thing. And so I think that did have some effect. How much is really difficult to say, and I know there are experts out there, specifically on the LSAC side, who would debate me on that and say, you're not right about it. But those two factors to me are big.
I think there's also experts that would say, if you're taking a test at home where you get to pick the hour of the day you're taking it, unlike ever before, you're not driving an hour to show up in front of 35 other nervous wrecks. And we're not faulting anyone for being nervous. I was nervous when I took the GMAT. I guess I wasn't nervous when I took the SAT just because I cared about scoring touchdowns and not going to college. But you can see a scenario where you're taking tests around a bunch of nervous people. That is a real phenomena that a lot of people would say is it's transferable from one person to another. You throw in having, and this happened to me, the marching band playing below during the LSAT, right? Distractions from other people. Your dad's not cheering you on 1 minute before the test from the kitchen downstairs, and you're picking the hour of the day. And here's where the experts would really chime in. You're setting conditions for state-dependent learning to be favored. If you're studying in your bedroom and you're taking it in the bedroom, look, I'll never forget the psychology professor. I was a psych minor. The psychology professor that said, look, if you have 2 beers while you're studying for a test, have 2 beers when you take the test. And of course, all of us morons were like, oh, we should drink beer and then study. The point is, the more akin the conditions are in your study environment to the real day environment, the better you're probably going to retain the information, distract it from your brain, and put it on paper. So I think conditions were easier at home.
Yeah, and I don't think you're wrong about that, because that's my contention, is that the shorter test and your control over your environment, I think it has an impact. And at least anecdotally, I can point to hundreds of people who I've spoken to after the test and the way they feel. And it definitely is something that psychologically is a positive. So it's a really good thing for applicants going forward that it's going to remain that way.
Dave, do you want to speculate a little bit about the addition of the 4th section starting in August, the bringing back of the experimental?
You know, it's for some people a big surprise that the experimental section is coming back. And for those of you who don't know what it is, to create this test, they have to pre-test the items and give groups of test takers an opportunity to work through questions to make sure that they're valid and they have integrity. And the way they do that on past LSATs is they've added what's called a variable or experimental section, where they throw that somewhere into the mix, and then they can say, all right, this person scored a 160 on the LSAT. This is how they did on their experimental. This person scored a 165. That's how they did. And they build a profile of statistical information about the questions and make sure that they're actually valid. When the pandemic hit and they came out with the flex, they really had a problem in terms of like taking the test at home and the structural setup with that. And so they dropped the experimental for the last year plus or so. Now in August of 2021, the experimental is returning, and probably none too soon, because I can tell that LSAC is running a little low on test content. We've talked a lot about the tests they can choose from and the limitations thereof on other podcasts and so forth.
Dave, am I going to get in trouble for reminding everyone that, if I remember correctly, you predicted pretty well the June test, or at least one of those?
You're not getting in any trouble at all from me.
Yeah, you're branding him. He's an oracle.
You know, let me say, we've done that twice now in the last couple of years. It's a rare thing, but it's also not really something that we should be able to do. I shouldn't be able to pin it down to a limited number of options where that would be the case. And part of what's happening with the experimental is they need to bring back the opportunity for them to test questions and have more diverse question banks to work with. Now, this goes back to the theory of what we're just talking about, where LSAC says that a 3-section test, a 4, and a 5-section test show no deviation in terms of performance, that the same student will perform equally on all 3 versions, and that there is no degradation of performance in the 4th and 5th sections. So the theory is, I think that the 4th section won't make a difference. I disagree with that. I actually think that it will, and it just stands to reason. It's more fatigue to kind of work through. But it has also been said that with the pandemic seeming to kind of wind down a little bit, I guess we'll have to see, that what we're starting to see is less studying by certain students. And I don't think that happens so much in the spring of this year, maybe even through June, but I would think in the summertime, we monitor this on our system, the amount of time that users are on there and how much work they're doing, we expect to see it drop a little bit. And that will probably contribute to a decrease in those high scores, which means that bubble will deflate just a little bit.
Can we backtrack for a second before we get too far advanced? We were talking about last cycle numbers. I am curious, Justin, Dave, and I spent a good amount of time with law schools on this, so I'm not sure if I can say much, but I am curious what you all think medians will look like. Just for the listeners, medians come out through law schools in September, but law schools have this huge disclaimer. Look, if we lose some students, it's possible the median we're reporting on our website, by the time we reported October 15th to the ABA, might go down a point. So nothing's set in stone until it's reported October 15th, and then it's publicly announced in December. So let's just pretend we're in December. Where do you think the medians are going to lie for law schools this year versus in past years?
Yeah, well, Mike, you and I both know we've talked to a number of law schools about this, and we won't name names, but I think we both know that there are +2s, +3s in LSAT median from schools across a wide range of, I hate to use this as a definition, but a wide range of rankings. So I think we can expect some pretty widespread improvement in medians. I know that LSAC recently did a presentation where they talked about the applicant profile this year, and the 50th percentile applicant had an LSAT 2 points higher this year than they did last year. Now, that's not test takers, that's applicants. And we know that applicants tend to be more represented among people who do better on the LSAT. So still, that's a pretty big change. +2 in the applicant LSAT median, that's a lot. And GPAs went up as well by about 0.05. So it's not just that we saw better LSATs, we saw better GPAs, and we saw more of them. Like we've talked about, 8,000 or 9,000 more applicants this year who on average had a better statistical profile. I can't see any scenario in which medians aren't going up pretty significantly.
So +0 to +4 would seem to be the range. Maybe 1 or 2 schools -1.
Yeah, you'll always see some outliers in the negative. Something that we saw this year was schools had a hard time estimating what their yield was going to be from among the applicant pool. And that's understandable, right? We've talked about this. 8 or 9 years of flat or declining volume. when you have 8 or 9 years of building your models for your incoming class on seeing applicants be flat or seeing applicants be down, having to deal with a year where applicants were up as much as they were, especially in the higher ranges. I know we keep harping on that, and I don't want to make people feel like we only care about the high-scoring applicants. We harp on that because what happens in those ranges has a trickle-down effect on everyone else. So when schools are using these models, they just weren't worth very much this year. And that's why you see all of these reports about over-enrollment. It wasn't that schools were admitting more people. They weren't. I don't think, Mike, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't talked to a single school who admitted more people.
Yes, it's almost always less people, but the yields are so much stronger. I think that spreadsheet we produce every year that has green is plus GPA and green is plus LSAT and red, it's going to be like green, 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 green across the board. Do you think we'll see a 175? You and I were just debating that, Justin.
Yeah, there are a couple schools who could do it. More than a couple if they really wanted to be ambitious about it. I won't bore the listeners with the mechanics of why schools go for certain medians. I'll just say beyond a certain point, from a ranking perspective, it doesn't really help a law school to go above really a 172, 173. You don't get much from that. I would concentrate more on GPA if I was them, but I'm not running their admissions departments. And it is nice to brag about a 175 LSAT median, so we could see it. I think we will definitely see 174s among the top 20 schools. I think we'll see a lot of plus twos. I know that we'll see some plus three. So it's going to be an interesting year for medians. And we'll talk about this a little later because the medians this year might not be representative of what things look like next year.
Right. For the first time ever, we'll talk about it later. It's going to be interesting. Killoran, do you think we'll see keeping in mind medians, not an average, half above, half below, you think we'll see a school come in with a 4.0 median?
No. I think we'll see a 175 before we see a 4.0.
Ooh, laying down the marker. I don't know. Alabama really loves those GPAs.
Yeah, see, what's funny is I don't see us getting into a 175 because I think that's a law school signaling too much to the market, too much to applicants. We care so much about LSAT, and they don't need to. As Justin says, there's almost a diminishment of returns to the point of it being nullified. I would personally suspect we don't see a 175, and maybe I'm 49% confident on a 4.0 median, which is just absurd.
It is pretty ridiculous. But I think Mike, you hinted about this. I think one of the nice things about this surplus in applicants and high-scoring applicants this year is we have seen law schools take advantage of the opportunity to enroll students who offer something other than just numbers, more than they might have historically. I think we, in our conversations with law schools, have seen really impressive increases in the proportion of diverse commits to attending in the fall. So that's something positive that came out of this. I think schools took the luxury of this opportunity to concentrate on things that they really care about, building out a good class. Mike, I know you hate the word holistic, so I won't use it. But there were other factors that they had an opportunity to look to this year, and that was nice to see.
Yeah, I would say that schools really want to, every year, these are people, they're human beings reading applications. They want to read and care about every element of the application. The only reason I don't like the word holistic is I hear it 74 times a day. So what I would say is this cycle was a great opportunity for later in the cycle when a lot of schools got their numbers beautifully locked in on their end to say, let's take a look at this person on our wait list who didn't have the numbers. I just got a testimonial from one of my consultants this morning from an applicant who's going to Stanford. And what happened was this applicant had a wonderful life experience. And in crazy cycles like this, numbers do get locked in. And some of those people get to catch that lightning in a bottle where the admissions person spends a lot of time on the application and says, I don't care if they're below one median or both medians. And that'll happen every cycle. It just tends to get obscured in these competitive cycles, but it actually happens a little more in the competitive cycles because the numbers get locked in earlier. So maybe time to put the bookmark on this past cycle. I think some people hit home runs because of that phenomena you're speaking of, Justin. I think transitioning to the next cycle, one thing we're going to see, though, is a lot of reapplicants. About 33% of the people who have contacted our firm have been people asking us about reapplying. That's an extraordinarily high number, a number we've never seen before.
Dave, what have you been seeing on the reapplicant front?
It's a little more anecdotal. I can't say 33% because so many of our clients are coming into the LSAT for the first time. And we don't work with really the same student body that you guys do. But certainly the number of people that we're hearing from and talking to that are reapplying or that didn't really even apply, just opted out because they could tell that things weren't going well, that's off the charts compared to what we've seen before. So it's a more anecdotal take than yours, but it certainly supports what you're saying there. And I think that all feeds into what's happening in this upcoming cycle. So let's run down what we think is going to happen in the upcoming year and give some insights there.
I have an analogy, if anyone wants my analogy. I'll do the analogy and Justin, correct me if I'm right or wrong on data. So imagine a lap of a track, a 400-yard dash. Most years law schools start with some deferrals and some reapplicants. That favors them, of course. More people applying if they're reapplicants, already a fuller class if they're deferrals. So let's first talk about the deferrals. A number of schools came in over-enrolled and offered deferrals. To be determined, none of us know, except for the individual schools, and they're not really saying anything publicly. But you can see a scenario where more schools take those over-enrolled seats, offer scholarships, and start off with 20 deferred admits versus 10. But here's another thing that we're seeing for the first time ever. Hey, applicant, you're on our wait list. We'll give you a deferred admit for next year. That is signal over noise. And what I mean by that is what that signals to us is that these schools, if the person has a 170 and they were waitlisted because the school's coming in with a 171, the school is actually anticipating maybe having a 170 next year because they see that the bubble is going to come down. But for the first time ever, 170 on the wait list is being offered a year in advance. It's like recruiting a 14-year-old to your football program and offering them a full scholarship. You see that in NCAA football programs. Hey, waitlisted person, we'll give you an admit next year right now if you accept it and withdraw and don't apply next year. So that's going to increase the deferral. So I'm sticking with my track analogy. Law schools are 25 yards down the track, and we haven't even blown the gun yet starting next cycle. Now, when you add in the reapplicants, they're like 45 yards down the track. That's the bad news. Law schools have a 45-yard head start on a 400-yard dash. Here's the good news, and then I'm going to shut up and let Justin correct me if I'm wrong. I think law schools are going to be slower, and I'm just using this in the analogy of running speed. I think they're going to slow down and applicants are going to speed up, where this past cycle, what we saw is the law school is pulling away because of that bubble at the top. The law schools got faster, more competitive, and a lot of the applicants slowed down because of that lack of speed. So what's going to favor applicants is we're going to run out of the bubble. We're going to run out of scores at the top. But early on, it's not going to feel like that. September, October, November, it's going to feel really slow for an applicant and really competitive because it's going to feel like law schools are ahead of you in the race.
Yeah, listen, everybody. We dragged Mike out on a track and made him actually run these numbers. So these are legit. No, but it is true. It's a good analogy, Mike. Every year, like you said, we do see deferrals and we do see reapplicants. But I don't think we've ever before seen schools promote deferrals in the way that they did this year, openly asking students to defer, in some instances offering students substantial increases in scholarship and even other things to get them to defer to next year or even to 2023. So it remains to be seen how many people take those offers. A lot of people, when they apply to law school in a given cycle, they're pretty committed to attending that year. And it takes a lot to get them to wait. Some people will have taken that offer, though, and almost certainly more than usual. And the thing is, every single person who takes a deferral offer takes more than one acceptance off the table at that law school, because law schools don't have a one-to-one conversion ratio from applicants to matriculants. So one person taking a deferral offer at a law school could take as many as 7 or 8 acceptances off the table from that law school, because the law school knows they're going to have this person attending this year. They don't need to make that many offers to get the class that they want. That number is going to depend on the law school and their typical yields. So, my 7 or 8 example is exaggerated for some schools, and it's an underestimation for other schools. It really just depends. But the point is, you are going to be taking acceptances off the table. And I think it is fair to say we're going to have more reapplicants next year. We just are. For one thing, if you look at the June LSAT, there were more people taking the LSAT as retakers this year than there were last year. We don't have a good comparison for the April test this year, just because there was no April test last year due to COVID and the world generally being on fire. But that test also had a lot of people retaking it. Retaking this late in the cycle, it's a sign that you're probably considering, at least some of those people, reapplying next year. Some people were using it certainly to try and get off a waitlist this year, to try and negotiate more money from scholarship this year. But a lot of those people are retaking it because they are very seriously considering applying next cycle. They weren't happy with their outcomes this year. We've talked about that a lot. The difference in what people's expectations were this year and their outcomes. The more disappointed you are, I think it's fair to say the more likely you are to try applying in the following cycle and see if you can get what you thought you were going into this year. There are also some numbers to back that up. If we look at the number of matriculants to law school every year, it is nowhere near the number of people who apply to law school. There is always a surplus of applicants compared to matriculants, and that just makes sense. But let's just play around with this year. We know things are going to be over-enrolled this year. Mike, Dave, correct me if you think differently, but I think saying that schools end up over-enrolled 10%, probably not going to be more than that. So if we assume that we're looking at about 42,000 matriculants to law school in this fall, we are still going to have about 4,000 more people who applied and didn't get into law school or didn't attend law school in the fall than we did last year. That's just surplus people who are basically without a chair come this fall. And those are prime candidates to be reapplying. In total, it's about 29,000 people that we're going to be looking at who applied this year and are not going to be attending. That is a lot of people.
Yeah, some of those decide they just don't want to go to law school, and a number decide they want to reapply. There's a humanistic side to this that we all have lived. My experience was I opened up on Twitter for a few days. Hey, anyone can call me if they get a slot, and let's just talk about your cycle. And I got to hear the stories from a lot of those people. So I don't even want to talk in just data terms. I feel horrible for the person who applied to 14 schools and got 0 admits. And that's a tough conversation to have.
It's the worst conversation. But now, if you think about those reapplicants, one of the things that happens is they come in ready to go. It's not as if they're just normal applicants who kind of like wander in November and December and January. All the people that we've been working with who said, look, I'm going to try it again, they're all looking at that very first week of the window. They want to be the first ones in. And you said before, Mike, you're like, the first month or two of this upcoming cycle is going to look really competitive and bad. And that's just going to be more fuel to the fire. The deferrals, when somebody opts into another class, you lose seats from that, as Justin was talking about. And then you have these reapplicants who have just spent their entire summer making sure that hopefully every piece of their application is as well crafted as possible. Mike, you'd know more about that than me. And then they show up in the first week and they all of a sudden present a profile that I think to law schools, they're going to think to themselves at first, wow, this is looking like the exact same thing that we saw last year. And we already know how bad this was. I don't think that lasts the whole time, but it certainly is going to look pretty challenging for applicants in the first month or so.
And here's the thing. Let's say 4,000 people listen to this podcast. That's going to be 60 to 70,000 who don't and don't hear this message. And I hope the people who do hear this message take it to heart. September and October and November are going to look like really tough months. Law schools are going to be making really slow decisions. There's this mythology that the day you apply, if it's early, gives you this bump. It's a false positive. The bump is the people being admitted in September and October are going to be incredibly strong applicants. If they applied in December or January, they would have been admitted. So it's not the date they're admitted, it's the data and the application they have that's getting admitted. There's the false positive. So what's going to happen, and this is going to happen, I promise you, and we can't say this enough, and it'll still be kind of drowned out by the noise. So many people are going to say, where's my September admit? Where's my October admit? Where's my November admit? Or, oh my God, it's November and people are being admitted and I haven't applied yet. But again, to go with my running analogy, schools are at about the 100-yard line, the 200-yard line. schools are going to slow down tremendously. Unlike this past cycle, that's when things are going to change for the better.
This is once bitten, twice shy. They just went through a cycle where a lot of schools acted normally and then realized they had to start making changes, and it slowed way down. I don't think they're going to come out of the gate really fast just on that count alone. It's human nature to say, maybe we need to see what happens. Because the tornado that went through the cycle this year with more applicants and more high LSAT scores, everybody knows there's a bit of carryover to what's going to happen this year. So I can't see them coming out of the gate fast and saying, oh, things are back to normal. I think they're going to be very wary.
They were burned by some messaging. They were told by people who also were interpreting the data that things were going to normalize. For reasons understandable, some schools listened to that message and thought the historic data would be a good model for this cycle, and it never shook out like that.
Yeah, I think next cycle is going to be almost as challenging if you're a law school trying to anticipate what you need to do to build the class profile that you want. And I think that just makes sense. It's going to be hard for them to compare to this year. This is not a normal year. It's not a normal year in terms of typical measures of interest in a law school. People can't really visit law schools. People are engaging through Zoom and other online platforms, so schools aren't getting some of the traditional metrics that they used to measure interest that they did. The forums were all online that LSAC hosts, which is very different than the in-person stuff they usually do. But then you've also got the issue of, we keep coming back to this, and I know we're boring about it at this point, but the score bubble, right? If LSAT scores normalize a little bit, if you don't see that kind of concentration among high-scoring applicants, if you see things distributed a little bit more normally, then comparing applicant volume in 21-22 to this past cycle is not going to be particularly helpful, right? You're going to be drawing conclusions about how things are going to look based on data that doesn't really apply. And I think schools are going to be, hopefully, smart enough to realize that, or at least cautious enough to recognize that that is happening, right? I think that that is going to be something that contributes to them moving much more slowly. We've already seen Duke eliminated priority track. I don't know how long that's been around, but they got rid of that this year. And we don't know for certain that that was in response to the issues of making a lot of decisions early, kind of locking yourself into a class profile that maybe wasn't what you could have had or resulted in you being over-enrolled. But it is a sign, I think, that there is awareness among law schools that they need to approach this a lot more carefully this coming application cycle. I think that the other thing that's going to contribute to that, we've talked about what the medians are going to look like this year. If you're a law school and you just increased your median LSAT, you just increased your median GPA, are you really going to want to give that up if the numbers aren't quite there to support it this year? Are you going to want to have to go and explain to your boss why, after one of the best application cycles on record, your medians aren't going to be what they were in fall 21? That doesn't sound like a lot of fun to me. And we all know that there is a lot of pressure on law schools from different sources to keep those medians as high as possible. Schools are not going to want to commit to a path that results in them having lower medians until they absolutely have to, until the data shows that they have no choice but to do so.
Yeah, the pressures from U.S. News and World Report primarily. I was talking to our COO, Anna Hicks, last night, and I said, Anna, what if we did our own rankings and we called it the most flawed, nonsensical rankings ever? And let's pretend everyone at Spivey Consulting who works at Spivey Consulting were to be admitted to every law school on the planet. Rank your top 20 that you would go to. So this is a nonsensical rankings. But part of the reason we would like to do it, and get ready because it might be coming, is to just point out how silly rankings are. But the pressures from the rankings I've gotten. I started 21 years ago. The pressures were a third what they are now as far as how close attention people play to rankings. So that LSAT pressure is rankings based. Unless you can think of another entity, I can't. I mean, the LSAT correlates with bar performance. It correlates with first year GPA, but I don't think that's where the pressure is coming from.
Not at the level of a lot of these schools. If your average is 160 or above, you feel like your students are going to pass the bar. there's not any kind of fear. And really 150 or above, everybody's feeling pretty comfortable. It's that kind of like 140, low 140s range where they start to have that, will we get these people through the bar? So I don't think it's the bar or anything like that. It's all U.S. news.
Yeah, I'll say I have heard a few more human type of motivations, right? Law schools are run by people, and people are competitive. And there is a certain feeling of satisfaction when you can brag that your law school had, the biggest increase in LSAT or GPA. You can brag about how great those are, how qualified your incoming class is. That's a normal, human, understandable motivation. But yeah, I 100% agree with both of you. The primary cause of this obsession, which could be a podcast series of itself, is U.S. news and the malign influence that U.S. news has on decision-making at law schools. But we won't go there because we'll all lose our tempers, and the listeners don't want that.
I'll start leaking things and get sued. I will say, Justin, you're right. I have been one of those people on the other side. And when we would go to conferences, it was always, what is your new LSAT? No one would ever say, what's your new GPA? There is a sort of psychological competitive part.
Reinforcing my idea that there'll be a 175 before a 4.0, maybe?
We'll see, man. I mean, look, I will tweet. If you're right, Dave, I will tweet out to the world, I am a moron and Dave Killoran is all-knowing. Deal?
I can't lose with that deal. Let's go ahead and take it.
Yeah, honestly, Mike, what do you get if you're right? I mean, you just offered Dave everything.
Yeah, I mean, I gave up nothing in that.
They're going to say PowerScore hacked Spivey Consulting's Twitter account, so I don't really lose anything,
Oh, man, this is the guy who runs our company negotiations for business deals and whatnot.
He's giving away the farm, man. You better watch out over there.
Mike, you bring Anna to those meetings, don't you?
I've never professed to be good at business.
That's frightening. But no, I mean, getting back to what we were talking about in the 21-22 cycle, let's just talk about the LSAT registrants to get things a little grounded in some numbers, right? Because we all know that there are now alternatives to the LSAT that people can use. Primarily the GRE is the big one, but the GRE makes up about 5% of applicants to law school in a given year for the past few years. It goes up a little bit every year, but not dramatically. It's a factor, but it's not a tremendous one. The LSAT remains far and away the test for people applying to law school. And so this coming cycle, I look at the numbers and I see about the same number of first-time registrants for the LSAT from April through projecting what we'll see in August that we did last year. And Dave could probably talk about this a little bit more, why you have to compare over that whole period to get a decent comparison, because comparing one test to one test this year and last, not a great idea. Dave, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that one's an easy one to talk about. I mean, the clearest way to make that comparison is there haven't been tests in the same months. So you can't all of a sudden say it's a July to July comparison if there was no July test in one of those years. The other thing is, and I think you and I were talking about this beforehand, is the idea of when people apply. It starts a lot of that April test taking through June into August. These are people who are thinking about taking the LSAT maybe for the first time and applying for the first time. It's not a lot of carryover in, say, a month like April from people who are trying to get in at the very last minute on this ending cycle right now. So as you look at that window, if you were to just say on an LSAC year by year comparison, it's really hard to see it because it keeps moving around a little bit. And last year, when we looked at the registrations, there was a July and August test on their cycle. This year, there's only an August test. And so it's hard to see that. When you open up that window the way you just did, you get a more accurate picture of who is actually preparing to apply to law school this fall. And of course, it's not as if August is the end. You have tests thereafter, October, for example, and it continues on where you will add more and more applicants. But as you're talking about right now is what does the early picture look like? And I think as you demonstrated earlier in our conversation, it's really similar right now. So if this past year saw a really big increase of applicants, and this year so far is matching it, that means you're still looking at a really large number of applicants compared to, say, 3, 4, 5 years ago.
Or compared to 8 of the last 10 years would be another way of looking at it. But probably when it all is said and done, I'm not going to use bubble. The bump at the top is not going to be as high this cycle as last. So one way of summarizing is early data would be indicative of possibly same number of applicants, possibly, but our philosophical belief, having done this for between the three of us many, many years, is probably not that bump at the top, 165 and above.
Yeah, I think that's probable. I think even with some of the more recent LSATs, we've seen that bubble deflate a little bit in the results. I think we're seeing something of a return to at least what we were seeing in the 2019-2020 cycle.
Right, which was up.
Average LSATs were up that year. This isn't something that happened for the first time this cycle, but that year was more like it had been historically than this year. This year we were a bubble on top of a bubble, which was just a nightmare. I think we'd go back to maybe just a bubble, which, hey, that's an improvement, right? But Dave, something you talked about was the April LSAT. And that's one that really was a question for us going in, right? April's new. There was a plan, as I recall, for an April test last year, but we all remember what happened with that. The question was whether April was going to be primarily for this year, this cycle, or for next cycle. And when you look at the number of people who have applied with an LSAT score since April test results came out, the data shows that, at least among first-time test takers, it's pretty clear that people were primarily taking it with the intention of applying in the upcoming application cycle, 21-22, not for the 2020-2021 cycle. There were some, definitely, but the vast majority seem to have been aiming for this upcoming cycle. And that's where you kind of get into the whole, we have an equivalence in the number of test takers this cycle and last.
You just used a term I haven't heard before, which I think is perfect, the double bubble.
Copyright.
I really like that because on the side of what I do, which is more so LSAT focused, we've talked about that scoring bubble quite a bit. But there was also an increase of applicants. And so more applicants with more high scores, that's that double bubble. And if you look at what's happening this year, I think we're all in agreement that the LSAT portion of that bubble is going to come down. There's still going to be more high scores applying because there's carryover from the prior year, but I don't think the LSAT's going to continue to contribute to that at the rate that it has been. And whereas that is coming down a little bit, the other portion of it, which is more applicants, relatively speaking, it's not going to increase again, but because it already had increased, it is its own kind of bubble. So I like that, going from the double bubble to the single bubble. That's how I'd see it as well.
The way my admissions mind, if I have a mind, interprets all this is I would rather, as an applicant, all things being equal, apply this upcoming cycle than this past cycle. And I'm just going to throw in another wrinkle just to mess with everyone's life plans. I'm pretty sure I would even rather be applying one extra cycle out. And we do get this question, hey, Spivey Consulting, I can stay with my job for this upcoming cycle. It makes no difference to me, or I can apply this cycle. All things being equal, what would you do? And I say, it's that 40-yard start for the law schools. It's not going to be like that 2 cycles from now. So this upcoming cycle, I can say with a decent amount of confidence, not going to be as horrific as this past cycle.
As someone who's going through the OCI process right now, if you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking about taking some time off to work, I cannot recommend it enough.
Oh, yeah, because of the class increases, too.
I mean, not even that. Employers like seeing that you actually have done something in your professional life. They like seeing that you are someone who can be relied on to show up, usually on time, and be tolerable enough to be around, that someone doesn't fire you. So there are benefits to it, right? And there are benefits from an admission perspective, too. Law schools know that they need people who are going to be employed when they graduate. Great way of knowing that someone's going to be employed when they graduate is seeing that they've been employed before. If you have the opportunity to take some time to work, I can't recommend it enough. I haven't talked to anyone who has regretted taking that opportunity.
Yeah, I'm a former career services dean as well. It makes your interviews skills a little bit better. You have more to talk about.
Let me ask you both a question. If the current cycle is a 10 in terms of difficulty, 10 being the worst, and let's say the cycle prior to it was average, we'll say it's a 5. Where would you put the upcoming cycle on that scale?
I'm going to go with an 8.5.
Yeah. So to begin with, this current cycle was a 10. It is the most difficult we've seen in our lifetimes, maybe the most difficult ever. It's funny Justin said 8.5 because that's the number that popped in my head. So that's weird that two people would both come up with a fractional.
It's almost like we work together a lot.
Right. So I'm also going to go, last cycle was a 10. This cycle is an 8.5. The further out you get, the harder it is to come up with these numbers. Next cycle, maybe a 6.5.
Yeah, I think a lot is going to depend on the factors that we don't know for certain yet. But I will say, when I'm describing this cycle as a 10, I'm incorporating a lot of that uncertainty into that description. The fact that applicants and law schools didn't know what was going on and just created so much chaos. I think even if, God forbid, we see applicant increases next year, high score bubble stay, at least people are going to be more prepared for it. That alone has to count for something.
That's probably why I would go more towards 8, but I think of myself as more of an optimist than you guys. And you're probably right. It's probably more like 8.5, but I am hoping that at worst it's an 8. And then I think actually, Mike, your follow-up there is really useful too, because I don't know that the following year goes back to 5, but 6 to 6.5 sounds really about right to me in terms of that kind of like slowly decreasing the pressure and the challenges. And that's assuming most things stay the same. We don't see any incredible craziness like we just saw in the last year.
But we do have sort of societal divisiveness that tends to lean towards more people being civic-minded going to law school. So that golden run, the go-go years of 5 competitive, 4 competitive, 3 competitive, those levels are probably, for the next 3 to 5 years, less likely.
Yeah, and you always have to wonder if there's ever going to be student loan reform that kind of throws a wrench in all this, right? Right now, and this is not a moral judgment for all listeners, this is just a policy observation, folks, it's pretty easy to fund your law school education using federal student loans. If that ever became more difficult, if we ever saw an increase in price sensitivity among applicants, you got to wonder, is that going to put downward pressure on the number of applicants? Now, I don't think that's likely, certainly as long as this political administration is around, but eventually, I mean, what are we at? $1.25 trillion student loans in this country? You got to wonder if eventually someone's going to look at that problem and say, all right, we need to do something about this.
We have, just as an announcement for the audience, we have a student loan expert coming up for our podcast who, I'm not making this up, she's also a 4-time Olympian, 1-time bobsledding, 3-time sprinting.
Wow, I am just such a non-accomplished person.
Right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the Olympic experience, but then we're going to talk a lot about student loans.
That's odd because it sounds a little bit like Lolo Jones, but it's like inverted with the sports, and I know it's not her, so now I'm really interested to know who.
Her name is Lauren Williams, Lauryn, 4-time Olympian. I'm looking forward to it.
So I think we all agree next cycle still going to be pretty competitive, right?
Yeah.
Agreed.
Slower too, I think.
Very slow.
Which isn't the worst thing for applicants. I understand it'll be frustrating in the moment. I completely sympathize. Submitting your application and then having to wait months, sometimes 6, 7, 8 months to hear a decision. That sucks. That just sucks. But I think that if law schools are moving more slowly next cycle, that is going to be ultimately to the applicant's advantage. I think that that's going to result in the same decision eventually that you would have gotten even if they moved a little bit earlier. And I think it's also going to result in you not matriculating to a school with a class that's 30% bigger than you thought it was going to be. So there are going to be some positives to a slower decision cycle.
Yeah, and better decision making. Law schools would say that. I've been on the law school side of things. The more accurate your data is, the better you can make decisions, including how many people can we admit below our medians that we really want to admit. So I would agree. The slowness is going to be aggravating as all tomorrow. I'm curious, Justin and Dave, Harvard last year set their calendar dates. We're going to be announcing our decisions on these dates. I imagine that benefited Harvard this year. I wonder if we'll see more schools follow that suit. That's more typical at the undergraduate level, but I think we might see more law schools do that.
It's a tradition at the undergrad level. When that happens in California here, there's just newspaper story after newspaper story and people on the TV of, stories of getting into Berkeley or Stanford or what have you, but it's primarily the UCs that are doing that. So it wouldn't surprise me if that became something normalized. It's almost like a college signing day. If they were able to push this back a little bit, it would certainly have pluses and minuses, but it wouldn't be unprecedented in kind of like the world of college athletics. It's also why at some point we're going to start seeing like freshmen and sophomores who have 4.0s getting early admit conditional offers to law school. Just like your sporting example where the 14-year-old gets a college basketball offer.
I'll disagree with you on both those.
I don't really think it's going to happen.
Yeah, law schools are run by lawyers, trained lawyers. So the reason why we haven't seen, this used to be the case, I believe, weird April Fool's Day, admit day in the undergrad world is because I think of fears of like anti-collusion. Law school deans are much more sensitive to that than the typical person. I know you were kidding about the sophomore, but yeah, when you're an admissions officer and you admit a sophomore with a 4.0, you know that some of those people are going to fall prey to the wiles of alcohol or whatever. And that 4.0 might become a 2.9 really quickly.
Wiles of alcohol. Oh my God.
Are you talking about my college career? What are you doing there?
I'm talking about the time you and I went to a national championship football game together, Dave.
That was good times.
I do kind of disagree with the idea, at least from a law school perspective, of giving a hard date when you'll say, this is when we're going to make a decision. I understand why it works for Harvard. It's Harvard. They know who they can admit. They know they have the pick of the applicant pool, and they have a really good idea of who's going to matriculate. And frankly, they're a very sophisticated admissions office. They can do that. I don't know if all law schools have the ability to do what Harvard is doing there. I think what would make sense is for law schools to say, look, we're not going to be making any decisions on regular applicants. So early decision applicants, you still get your early decision, but regular decision applicants, no one is getting a decision until, I wouldn't make any decisions until December 15th at the earliest if I was a law school. I might even wait until January, especially this year. So I think that is what I would do. And I would encourage schools to communicate that. I think one of the biggest sources of frustrations among applicants is not necessarily the wait. The wait sucks, but the waiting in silence is what really sucks. People submit their applications and they don't hear anything for months at a time, other than maybe you get an occasional form email that says, we are still considering your application. That's just not fun for anybody, right? Tell people up front, you're not going to hear anything until at least this time. That's when we're going to start making decisions. That gives the schools the opportunity to breathe, to assess their applicant pool, and to make smarter decisions. And it lets applicants know, okay, I don't have to refresh my status checker 30 times for these schools because I know I won't be getting a decision.
I mean, the silence is clearly terrible, but it's also you have silence while somebody else who has so-called similar numbers, they heard something. And then it becomes that comparison, that one-upsmanship. But I love that idea in part because that would have helped a lot of schools this year not make decisions they regretted a little bit later. They didn't rush to judgment, or they did, and that would stop them from doing so. I don't know that they'll get on board with that. And I was definitely joking about like the national signing date kind of thing, although it would be really interesting to see it happen live. But that's probably a conversation for another day in terms of whether or not there's ever a possibility of that happening.
That's probably an ABA conversation.
I think schools are aware that the group of applicants that grew up in this world grew up in a more comparative and evaluative society than ever before because of the grand experiment called social media. So I think schools do, just like we all want to sort of do what we can to sort of help ease all that tension that the comparative process. So I think schools actually might be pretty open-minded to saying things like, we're not going to make a single admit until December 1st, December 15th, because just like you referred to, Dave, you have a 171 and a 3.9 and you've waited 4 months, but the person who's inputting data, maybe accurate, maybe not, on a different website saying they have a 171 and a 3.9 has said they've been admitted to 6 schools. Look, I'm 49 years old and I feel pretty freaking grounded these days. That would mess with my mind.
Yeah, everybody's mind gets messed with at that point if you're the person who hasn't heard anything. And I watched that happen all the time this year, and I know you have too.
And just to be clear, some of the people inputting that data are just making numbers up. So it's not even necessarily accurate.
I can make some jokes, but I'm not gonna.
Yeah, we could talk about made up stories where we catch people making up stories. That would be a fun podcast. I'm going to do that the day I step down from this firm.
Yeah, let's not do that right now. That's another one that'll get us all riled up. I think the only thing we haven't really talked about is scholarships, which it's hard to know what schools' budgets are going to look like. I think we've all seen speculation and have all speculated that there will be more financial pressure on law schools as a result of COVID. But I have to say, I was pretty pleasantly surprised. It seems like this year, scholarships in terms of just raw numbers, raw dollars devoted to scholarships, it seems to have been pretty much in line with what it was the year before. So maybe that will continue. Maybe applicants will still be able to take advantage of the really wide opportunity to finance your legal education if you apply broadly and if you apply strategically. I don't know if you two have thoughts on that.
I wouldn't know where to stop if I started, so Dave, go ahead.
I mean, to be honest, Justin, I couldn't agree more about how that works. And of course, one of the things I like about doing LSAT preparation is that you can see what a bottom line difference it can make in terms of the financial outcomes that someone has. They may go out the first time and take it on their own. They get a certain score and it's pretty good. And then they begin to realize, wait, if I actually took more time and prepared harder and go out and get a higher score, that will actually change the amount of debt that I have when I come back later. And as we were talking before, the information shows really clearly that the more you study for a test like this, the more likely it is you are to increase your score. And that is LSAC's official explanation for why we had this scoring bubble. And what they're really telling you in an indirect way, and I'm kind of like tweaking it a little bit here, is if you want to do better on this test, spend more time studying. And if you do better on this test, you often see a financial reward in terms of the aid offers that you get in your scholarship packages. So I love that concept. It's one of my favorite things about doing this is watching somebody go through the process and instead of coming out with a boatload of debt, have it really reduced down to something manageable and hopefully eliminate it entirely.
Then I'll give the admission side to that. Give yourself difficult choices to make. You would much rather apply, particularly if you can get fee waivers, which are very possible if you ask LSAC, very possible if you ask law schools. Law schools can be very generous at times with fee waivers. I would much rather someone apply to 15 schools and have 7 difficult choices. Do I go to the lower ranked school for free? Not my decision to make, not anyone's decision to make, but the applicant and maybe their family. Or do I go to the higher ranked school with 25% merit aid or 50% merit aid? But you would much rather have in May of next year to be choosing between 3 to 7 options of various degrees of debt than forced into a box of one choice where you have to go to. If you can, apply broadly. This is a great year to apply broadly.
And we saw that too. A lot of people did.
Yeah, I think this year, more than any other, I would suggest that people apply to a range of schools. I would, as far as financially feasible, make a good list of safeties, reaches, and all in between. I think that it's going to be hard to make that list until we have more information starting later this summer. As usual, we'll put a spreadsheet out with medians as we start getting them, but start making that list and just as broadly as you can only be to your advantage. Any other final thoughts, folks?
That might be a good note to end on.
Yeah, appreciate you guys having me along. I've, as always, enjoyed it. It's always good to crack jokes at your guys' expense.
Hey, we like making fun of ourselves.
It's a good time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.